Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World, and here is today's content. When I first examined reports that a Russian reconnaissance vessel entered British waters and allegedly directed a laser at a UK military pilot, my instinct is not to leap towards sensationalism, but to understand the structural logic beneath the event. In international relations, isolated incidents rarely occur in a vacuum. They grow out of long-standing tensions, mistrust, and patterns of military signaling. What looks like a sudden provocation is more often than not the result of a deep and predictable strategic trajectory. From my perspective, the United Kingdom and Russia have been locked in a steadily deteriorating relationship for more than a decade. The breakdown did not begin yesterday. It stretches back through Crimea, the Skripal poisoning sanctions, NATO's expanded presence in Northern Europe, and Russia's increasing reliance on maritime intelligence gathering near NATO coastlines. So when I see an incident involving lasers, aircraft, and disputed waters, I read it as part of a much larger geopolitical fabric. Why would Russia send such a vessel near British waters? From my analysis, there are three primary motivations. First, intelligence collection. Modern maritime reconnaissance is no longer limited to passive surveillance. It includes mapping radar signatures, electronic communications, anti-submarine routes, and the rhythms of NATO patrol flights. Russia, feeling strategically pressured by Western alignment on Ukraine, sees intelligence gathering near NATO's northern frontier as essential to its national security. Second, signaling. Moscow has long used forward deployments to demonstrate resolve, especially when it wants to deter deeper Western involvement in Ukraine. If the UK increases military support to Kyiv, Russia may respond by pushing its ISR assets closer to British and Scandinavian waters to remind London that it too retains reach and strategic leverage. Third, domestic politics. Russian leadership, anxious about legitimacy, often portrays itself as under siege by the West. The optics of operating near British waters feed that narrative, a Russia that is still powerful, still active, still unafraid. The laser element complicates things. If the UK's claims are accurate, the use of a laser against a pilot is an extremely dangerous act, one that crosses from signaling into hazardous brinkmanship. Lasers can blind. They can cause mission failure. They can trigger a kinetic response. From my standpoint, such behavior, whether intentional or the result of an overzealous crew, represents reckless conduct that magnifies the risk of escalation. But I must also emphasize states often interpret incidents through political filters. Britain has its own incentives, deterrence signaling, alliance solidarity, and domestic politics. The UK may feel compelled to frame the incident strongly to maintain credibility within NATO and to reinforce its stance on Russia's aggression in Ukraine. In essence, what I see is not simply a ship and a laser. I see a fragile, overstressed security environment where one miscalculation could trigger a chain reaction neither side truly desires. And I see the need for disciplined, evidence-based diplomacy before narratives harden into confrontation. When I attempt to understand Russia's motives in an incident like this, I begin not with the sensational detail, the laser, but with the broader architecture of Russia's strategic thinking. Nations do not wake up one morning and decide to provoke a nuclear-armed NATO member unless they believe the risks are manageable, the benefits worthwhile, or the signals necessary. And Russia, for all its internal turmoil, remains a highly rational actor in the realm of military intelligence and geopolitical maneuvering. So why would Russia enter British waters and engage in a potentially escalatory act? First, Russia is operating from a position of perceived encirclement. From Moscow's viewpoint, one, I have long argued the West must understand, even if we disagree, the post Cold War security environment has tightened around Russia's borders. NATO expansion, intensified UK military cooperation with the Baltics, the militarization of the Arctic corridor, and the United Kingdom's strong military assistance to Ukraine all feed into a strategic narrative. Russia feels watched, pressured, and strategically disadvantaged. In such an environment, what do great powers do? They probe, they test, they collect intelligence, they push boundaries, not because they seek war, but because they want to understand how far the other side is willing to go. Russia's reconnaissance vessels, submarines, and electronic warfare aircraft have long operated their NATO waters. The difference now is the tensions are higher, patience is thinner, and the margin for error is dangerously small. Second, Russia uses gray zone tactics precisely because they fall below the threshold of war. Direct confrontation with Britain would be suicidal. Every strategist in Moscow knows this. But gray zone signaling, interference with sensors, aggressive maneuvering, laser illumination gives Russia a toolkit for sending messages without crossing into overt hostilities. These actions create ambiguity. Was it deliberate? Was it a local commander? Was it a miscommunication? This ambiguity becomes a strategic asset. Lasers in particular sit in a gray legal space. They can cause blindness, disorient pilots, interfere with targeting systems, yet they are not missiles, bullets, or kinetic engagements. Russia can always deny intentional harm and claim it was an optical instrument, environmental reflection, or pilot misinterpretation. This ambiguity limits escalation while maximizing messaging power. Third, Russia wants to remind the United Kingdom of its vulnerabilities. When a nation supports another country in a high-stakes war, as Britain supports Ukraine, it becomes part of the strategic equation. In Moscow's eyes, London is not a neutral actor. It is a battlefield supplier. It is a strategic adversary. It is to some extent co-belligerent in Moscow's worldview. Thus, operations near British waters are not merely reconnaissance. They are psychological demonstrations. We can operate near your territory. We can affect your pilots. We can pressure you at home while you pressure us abroad. For Russia, this is not escalation toward war. It is a balancing measure, an attempt to force the UK to internalize the cost of involvement in the Ukraine conflict. Fourth, Moscow is sending a message to NATO as a whole. When Russia acts near British waters, it also speaks to Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, France, and the United States. It signals we still have freedom of maneuver. We can still contest your spaces. We can still disrupt your operations. This is especially important because Russia's conventional forces have been strained by the war in Ukraine. When a military is stretched thin, signaling becomes a low-cost way to maintain the illusion of strategic strength. Finally, Russia's domestic politics incentivize such acts. A Russian leadership facing economic stagnation, international isolation, and wartime fatigue must continually demonstrate power. Incidents with Western militaries allow the Kremlin to claim that Russia remains unbowed, active, and capable. The narrative plays well domestically. Even NATO cannot stop us from sailing where we choose. But here is the deeper truth I've learned over decades of analyzing geopolitical crises. States often take dangerous actions not from a position of strength, but from insecurity. When Russia feels cornered, it reaches outward. When it feels weakened, it compensates with bold signals. And when the diplomatic channels are frozen, as they are now, these signals become the only language left. This is why the laser incident matters. It is not an isolated act of aggression. It is a symptom of a collapsing dialogue between nuclear powers dialogue that must be restored before miscalculation takes on a momentum of its own. When I turn from Russia's motivations to Britain's political calculus, I must apply the same analytical discipline, avoid caricature, avoid assuming malevolence and instead examine the structural incentives facing London. But I also cannot ignore a simple truth. Incidents like these are not merely military encounters. They become political currency. Governments frame them, amplify them, sometimes even instrumentalize them, depending on the geopolitical moment. So I must ask, could the UK be using this laser incident as leverage, as a diplomatic accelerant, as a narrative tool? I am not suggesting fabrication. That is not how responsible analysis works. What I am suggesting is that even genuine incidents can be shaped, emphasized, or contextualized in politically useful ways. And Britain today finds itself in a moment where strategic narratives carry immense weight. First, Britain is deeply invested in the Ukraine war, politically, financially, and symbolically. London has cast itself as one of Kyiv's staunchest allies. It has provided missiles, drones, training, intelligence, and long-range capabilities. At home, this policy enjoys broad elite consensus, but faces growing public fatigue. Costs are rising, strategic clarity is eroding, elections are looming. In such a climate, any Russian provocation near British territory becomes a valuable reminder both to the public and to NATO allies that the threat is real, that the stakes are high, and that British involvement is not optional but necessary. A laser incident, by its very nature, is visceral and easy to communicate. It reinforces the narrative. London has been advancing for 2 years. Russia is unpredictable, aggressive, and willing to endanger Western lives. That message matters politically. Second, Britain has an interest in maintaining strong NATO cohesion. As the United States becomes more unpredictable in foreign policy, oscillating between strong commitments and isolationist impulses, Europe increasingly looks to the UK to set the tone for its Russia policy. An incident like this offers Britain a platform to rally allies, demand unified responses, and reinforce the idea that European security is indivisible. In other words, even if the incident was unplanned or isolated, its political utility remains immediate. Third, Britain needs strategic justification for its high-tempo military presence in the North Sea and North Atlantic. For years, the UK has increased patrols, invested in new anti-submarine capabilities, and expanded its intelligence operations in northern waters. Critics have asked whether these expenditures are proportional to the threat. A Russian ship entering British waters, especially one engaging in dangerous signaling, helps answer that question for the Ministry of Defense. It offers evidence that the UK's strategy is justified, that it must remain vigilant, and that its maritime and air units are essential. The question is not whether London welcomes the danger. The question is whether London can use the danger to reinforce existing policy trajectories. Fourth, incidents like this allow British leaders to position the UK as a responsible global actor. If Britain responds calmly, proportionately, and transparently, it strengthens the narrative that London is the adult in the room, measured, disciplined, and rule-abiding, contrasting Russia's reckless behavior. This framing matters for diplomatic legitimacy, especially when the UK is lobbying non-Western states for sanctions, compliance, or political alignment on Ukraine. By presenting itself as the victim of Russian aggression, Britain reinforces the moral dimension of its foreign policy. Fifth, domestic political incentives cannot be overlooked. Prime ministers, defense ministers, and foreign secretaries facing political pressure often benefit from events that shift the national conversation toward external threats, not because they desire conflict, but because foreign crises have a well-documented ability to unify publics, override domestic controversies, and highlight leadership qualities. A laser incident with its almost cinematic quality is a ready-made political narrative: danger, bravery, foreign aggression, British resilience. But here is the deeper insight. Even if Britain finds political value in the incident. It does not mean Britain fabricated it or seeks escalation. States often use real events to bolster political objectives without crossing into deception or warmongering. That is why my interpretation is cautious, but clear Britain may very well amplify this incident for geopolitical and domestic advantage, but it is highly unlikely to deliberately provoke Russia into war. The risks of miscalculation are simply too great. London wants strategic leverage, not strategic catastrophe. Yet political incentives still matter, and they will shape how Britain narrates, responds to, and capitalizes upon this event in the days and weeks ahead. When examining Britain's decision-making in this tense moment, I find it essential to look beyond the immediate military encounter and instead consider the broader geostrategic incentives facing London. Nations rarely escalate over a single naval incident. They escalate when the political, economic, and alliance-driven context makes escalation seem advantageous or at least manageable. And Britain today operates under precisely such pressures. First, the United Kingdom is navigating a profound identity crisis in the post-Brexit era. Having separated itself from the European Union, Britain has worked relentlessly to reassert its status as a global player. One avenue to do so has been through tighter alignment with Washington. The logic is straightforward. By taking strong positions against Russia and China, Britain reinforces its image as a frontline defender of the Western security order. As I see it, London's political class views such demonstrations of resolve, whether symbolic or military, as a currency for influence within the transatlantic alliance. Second, there is a domestic political dimension that cannot be ignored. British leaders face stagnant economic performance, declining real wages, and intense political fragmentation. Under such circumstances, external threats offer a convenient narrative tool. If framed carefully, a Russian vessel in British waters can be used to rally public support, to shift media attention outward, and to project an image of strong leadership. I do not suggest that London fabricates the threat, but rather that it may amplify the danger to serve internal political needs. Third, NATO's evolving strategy plays a key role. Over the past several years, Washington and several European capitals have pressed for more forward-leaning postures in the North Atlantic and Arctic maritime regions. British naval surveillance operations, particularly near Russian routes, are part of this broader shift. When such operations intensify, frictions naturally increase. The Kremlin interprets these moves as encirclement. London, in turn, characterizes its behavior as deterrence. The resulting cycle actions justified by reaction to the other creates a fertile environment for incident and misinterpretation. This brings me to the question of escalation. Will Britain escalate? In my assessment, London does not desire a direct confrontation with Russia. The British defense establishment understands clearly that full-scale crisis with Moscow would be catastrophic. Yet Britain is comfortable engaging in controlled tension, a calibrated level of risk that signals strength but stops short of war. This is a delicate calculus, one that major powers frequently get wrong. The danger, of course, lies in misreading Moscow's tolerance. Russia does not see these maritime incidents as isolated or accidental. It sees them as encroachments on its security perimeter. If Britain responds with additional patrols, increased aerial reconnaissance, or rhetorical threats, Moscow may feel compelled to counter with its own escalation, perhaps more aggressive naval shadowing or cyber interference or diplomatic expulsions. Still, my expectation is that Russia will avoid immediate retaliation. Moscow has little incentive to provoke an open clash with a NATO member. Instead, it will likely adopt a strategy of strategic patience, formal protest, intensified monitoring of British naval assets, and reciprocal pressure in other geographic theaters. Thus, Britain's escalation is not truly about the incident itself. It is an expression of deeper structural forces, domestic insecurity, alliance commitments, and the geopolitics of deterrence. And it is precisely these structural forces, when interacting with Moscow's sensitivities, that make the present moment unusually perilous. When analyzing Russia's reaction to this incident, I begin by reminding myself and my readers that Moscow interprets global events through a security lens shaped by centuries of invasion and strategic vulnerability. From Napoleon to Hitler, Russia's historical memory is one of encirclement, and this memory plays a far larger role in contemporary decision-making than many Western policymakers acknowledge. Thus, when a British naval aircraft or reconnaissance vessel approaches Russian routes, Moscow does not view the episode as a routine patrol. It sees an encroaching threat on its strategic perimeter. In this context, Russia's alleged use of laser illumination, if indeed the event unfolded as Britain claims, would be designed not as an act of aggression, but as a form of signaling a sharp reminder to foreign forces that their proximity being monitored. I interpret such actions as part of a broader pattern of Russia's measured assertiveness. Moscow wants to remind NATO that it remains vigilant without crossing the boundary into direct confrontation. I expect Moscow to answer Britain's political narrative primarily through diplomatic channels, summoning ambassadors, issuing formal statements, and highlighting what it sees as Western provocations. At the same time, Russia will certainly take reciprocal measures in adjacent theaters. This may include enhanced naval presence in the Arctic, more frequent flyovers near NATO airspace, or expanded cooperation with non-Western partners. I emphasize here that this is not escalation for escalation's sake. It is Russia's way of maintaining parity of pressure. In Moscow's logic, failing to respond symmetrically would invite further Western encroachment. The risk always present in such situations is miscalculation. If Britain chooses to amplify the incident for domestic political advantage, and if Russia responds with increased surveillance or military posturing, the feedback loop could become dangerously unstable. This is the perennial challenge of deterrence politics. When two sides signal strength simultaneously, neither wants to appear weak, yet both want to avoid war. I expect Moscow to answer Britain's political narrative primarily through diplomatic channels, summoning ambassadors, issuing formal statements, and highlighting what it sees as Western provocations. At the same time, Russia will certainly take reciprocal measures in adjacent theaters. This may include enhanced naval presence in the Arctic, more frequent flyovers near NATO airspace, or expanded cooperation with non-Western partners. I emphasize here that this is not escalation for escalation's sake. It is Russia's way of maintaining parity of pressure. In Moscow's logic, failing to respond symmetrically would invite further Western encroachment. The risk always present in such situations is miscalculation. If Britain chooses to amplify the incident for domestic political advantage, and if Russia responds with increased surveillance or military posturing, the feedback loop could become dangerously unstable. This is the perennial challenge of deterrence politics. When two sides signal strength simultaneously, neither wants to appear weak, yet both want to avoid war. Still, in my assessment, Russia's strategic calculus is ultimately conservative. Despite its frequent portrayal in Western media as unpredictable or reckless, Moscow's leadership operates with a clear preference to avoid direct conflict with NATO. Economic constraints, geopolitical priorities, and the costs of further international isolation all point toward restraint. Russia will push back firmly, symbolically, and sometimes provocatively, but it will stop well short of steps that risk uncontrollable escalation. Thus, the Russian response to this incident should be understood not as an isolated act, but as part of a long-term strategic program, deter NATO encroachment, maintain credibility, avoid full confrontation, and exploit diplomatic channels to present itself as reacting rather than initiating. It is a delicate balance, but one the Kremlin has maintained for years and will try to preserve now. As I draw these threads together, I am once again reminded of how fragile Europe's security framework has become and how dangerously overstated narratives can push nuclear-armed powers toward unnecessary confrontation. The incident involving the Russian vessel and the alleged laser illumination of a British pilot is not in itself a trigger for war. But it is symptomatic of a broader structural breakdown, the collapse of trust, the erosion of communication channels, and the normalization of military signaling in place of diplomacy. My central conclusion is this: neither Russia nor the United Kingdom seeks open conflict, yet both are trapped in a political environment that rewards suspicion, escalation, and symbolic defiance. London views itself as the defender of a rules-based order. Moscow sees itself as the target of a Western security encirclement. As long as these narratives remain unchallenged, incidents like this will persist and the risks will slowly, inexorably accumulate. To move beyond this impasse, I offer several policy recommendations grounded in economic logic, strategic analysis, and historical precedent. 1. Rebuild direct military communication channels. Since 2014, the number of functioning technical hotlines and deconfliction mechanisms between NATO and Russia has decreased dramatically. This is a grave mistake. I strongly advocate restoring and expanding these channels, particularly between naval and air forces operating in the North Atlantic and Arctic regions. A direct line between commanders could diffuse 90% of these incidents before they become political crises. 2. Establish a joint investigation framework for aerial and maritime incidents. Britain and Russia should develop a rules-based, evidence-driven procedure for verifying contested events. Without shared facts, politics fills the vacuum with emotional narratives. A joint mechanism under OSCE supervision would allow both sides to examine radar logs, sensor data, and communication records without sacrificing national security. 3. Reinforce the principle of mutual non-provocation. Both sides must reduce military behaviors designed solely for signaling. Britain should recalibrate flight paths and surveillance operations that skirt Russian military routes, and Russia should refrain from laser illumination, radar locking, or aggressive intercepts. Responsible behavior requires reciprocal restraint. 4. Reintroduce economic dialogue to reduce strategic angst. Behind every geopolitical confrontation lies an economic anxiety, energy transition, sanctions, maritime access, and technological competition. A renewed economic working group between the UK and Russia, even if limited in scope, would reduce misperceptions by clarifying each side's long-term economic objectives. As I have argued for years, economic interdependence stabilizes while isolation radicalizes. 5. Prioritize Arctic security as a shared interest. The incident occurred in waters linked to broader Arctic navigation routes. Climate change is transforming the region into a new arena of strategic competition. Britain and Russia must treat the Arctic not as a battlefield, but as a zone requiring cooperative governance on fisheries, shipping, scientific research, and environmental protection. 6. Rebuild public narratives rooted in prudence, not hysteria. Ultimately, crises escalate, not because leaders are irrational, but because domestic political pressures reward melodrama. The UK should avoid framing every Russian action as aggression, and Russia should refrain from portraying every Western patrol as a provocation. Responsible statesmanship requires cooling public temperatures, not raising them. Final reflection. If there is one lesson from the past century, it is this: small incidents become large crises when dialogue collapses and assumptions harden into dogma. The UK and Russia do not need to be adversaries, and the world cannot afford another escalatory spiral. We must return to diplomacy not as a concession, but as the only rational foundation of modern international security.